Welcome to Value Education, a series of conversations with administrators, teachers, and students about meaningful issues in education. My name is Valerie Feit, and I'm co-director of school counseling and K-12 Enrichment Coordinator. And I'm here today with some exciting guests, but first let me introduce Dylan Spencer, who is my co-host. He's a junior at the Rye Neck High School, and our guests, who I think you're going to enjoy a lot. Anna Boswell, who's in grade 12, and Hanjae Lee, also in grade 12. Both of these students have a strong interest in urban studies. And my first question is, how did you become interested in urban studies, and how have you explored that interest?
I've been interested in urban studies from a very young age. Growing up in three very different cities, Charlotte, North Carolina, DC, and now I live in metro area New York. I've been in proximity to a lot of different changes, and the one common link I found into these changes was architecture in the built environment. So as all of these different patterns in different built environments had different effects on the people, I became really interested in learning how space affects how people learn and enjoy and live their everyday lives.
For me, I have always considered myself like a city guy. So I've spent most of my life in Seoul, South Korea, where I just loved everything about the cities. I used to just, go and hang out with my friends, go to, nearby shops and, local restaurants. But more importantly, it was about the people. So I just loved finding out stories about people, finding out about the culture, about the lifestyles. Every single person has their own background and stories and culture. And the fact that they do just so fascinates me so much.
Now, I know that you've both done a lot of work outside of school. Mm-hmm. What have you done to look into these issues?
Yeah, throughout high school, I've been interested in studying design. So my freshman year at the University of Pennsylvania, I took a course focusing on modular space and how that can conform to the corporate world or in cities, and how private spaces can still fit into reclaiming space in cities. My sophomore year, I spent my summer at the University of California, Berkeley, designing public space, a park at Berkeley Aquatic Park, a tentative pavilion design. So there was a lot of research and thought put into that. And last summer at Cornell University, I studied more about design principles. And at Rye Neck High School, with the ILP program, I was able to further all of these explorations and combine my belief in public space and modular design into a project that focused on reclaiming a city space and building a park in that space.
Wow. Okay. And Hanjae, what have you done?
So my interest in urban study really focuses on statistics and economics. So from my sophomore year, I've been working as a research intern at Hunter College under the guidance of Professor Oh, who is professor of Department of Sociology. Mm-hmm. And I have gathered crime statistics and socioeconomic as well as demographic data of the New York City areas. And I've also noticed a redevelopment project has been going on in the city of New Rochelle. And so I organized a meeting with a development manager and the city commissioner. And I've got this wonderful research opportunity where I was able to assess the effects or the possibility of gentrification in the city of New Rochelle, and I was able to conclude that the city was conducting their redevelopment project in a very well restricted manner, preventing a primary gentrification.
Hanjae, I was wondering, you conducted this research on a short term and found that little gentrification was happening. Do you think that if you studied over a longer period of time, you'd find that there was more gentrification, or you would find that the results would be a little different?
It's great that you mentioned that, because there is a term called indirect gentrification, mm-hmm. which actually happens after the initial or the primary gentrification. And that gentrification is largely driven by cultural factors and other factors other than the capital investment of which is part of the city planning. Yeah. So in the long run, I would definitely say there'll be more gentrification, okay. And I would definitely love to conduct an extra research on the long run.
Well, We've all heard the term, urban ecology, and I'm wondering if you could explain to us what that is.
Yeah, urban ecology has been super important for architects these past 50 years. In the early 20th century, from a historical perspectives, architects didn't really know what they were doing in creating these giant cities, and they didn't know how to deal with this massive population growth. So they decided to grid and box everything up, which wasn't necessarily healthy for all the humans, as we were trying to pack people in like sardines and make everything high density. So a woman named Jane Jacobs, who was a great urbanist thinker, developed this idea that the city is an ecosystem, and it almost functions like an organism in the fact that all the components are not necessarily separate. And when you plan, you have to think about multi-usage, multi-diversity, multi-density, and pack all of these things differently and not necessarily take it as a full face value. You have to think about everything as a whole when you're making policy and you're designing.
As Anna mentioned, I think it's really important that we need to see cities as like a living organism, almost like a system or mechanism that has a lot of different variables and factors within. And if you look at the economics or statistics point of view, you can see that income distribution or the rates of housing affordability or the household income trends, they all change simultaneously. And I think that is really works as an evidence that city is not just about the skyscrapers or the cars going around. It's really about this it's like a mixture that works simultaneously and affecting affecting each other very much.
Did you have a question? I wasn't sure if you had a question right there.
No.
Not right now? Okay. Because I guess when I listened to this, when we were speaking in the green room earlier, you mentioned the idea of this natural development versus planned development. Mm-hmm. It always looks to me like cities are just sprawls. So which is it?
Policy and natural growth can go hand in hand, and I think it's definitely a balance of extremes where you don't want to overplan and you don't want to underplan and let humans go and do what they will, because that can pose public safety concerns. So I think two really good examples of artificial and natural cities is how we sort of categorize it is an artificial city could be something that's hyper planned, like Chandigarh, India. In these sorts of cities, you see a lot of concrete. Maybe it'll be planned for private transport, maybe it'll be public, but in a lot of these places, there's not a lot of room for local stakeholders to take their place and shape their opinions. And in artificial cities like New York that have been developing and settling by bodies of water for years and years and years, there's a lot more time for culture to develop and for local heritage to take form and take shape.
I definitely agree with Anna, and as we mentioned before, city is a living organism, so the economic trends and statistical trends, they all weave into a certain policy or urban planning. And the evidence, I think, that you can find easily is the 1960s planning methods, which were largely influenced by the Reaganomics and Thatcherism. And these policies in 1960s were primarily state-driven, which means that state gave the rights to developers and real estate developers to redevelop and renovate housing units. And just by the fact that you see how the population changes and these reinvestment and disinvestments happening, it really proves the fact that the population and statistics does not go separate with the urban planning. It is quite inseparable.
Okay, I also think on that note, it's really important to add that those policies in the 1960s were to racially segregate cities, and they were state plans. So this was a form of de jure segregation. And I think that when we're talking about the dangers of policy, this is something that we should be really aware of. Even though it might not be as blatant in our society today, we should really be aware of the subtle ways that we're shifting and we're separating people, because without putting people together, and by forcefully splitting people apart based off of, their race or their socioeconomic status, we're really hindering a massive cultural development and societal development from happening.
So the natural progression that such impositions may inhibit, as you've said, how do those sort of from a cultural or socioeconomic standpoint, how do those natural phenomena affect a city, either economically, industrially, or through any sort of given lens?
I think that this is a problem that's been happening for decades, and for a lot of people, they're still facing the impacts of decisions that have been made more than 50 years ago, and it's still affecting people today by, their assets, the property that they own, and everything like that. So when we have cities today, there's actually positive policies that we can create, like vacancy taxes. So if people are building up a city or trying to develop or revitalize it, it's important that if you're building a very high-end loft or apartment set, you're in, just so it's not empty, we can tax the spaces, or even a percentage that can be affordable housing for people, so that nothing goes to waste and that we can be efficient in the way that we move forward and try to reconcile the past and make up for it.
When you look at those cultural shifts that you described and that you've spoken about, how does that fit into immigration waves and socioeconomic issues, for example, in terms of transportation?
The first part that you mentioned, the immigrant influx of immigrants, right? So I think this all really all these questions really ties together. And as Anna mentioned before, Anna mentioned the policy of segregation and how the public policy that urban planners make can really affect generations and generations after. So for example, in 1997, British Prime Minister Tony Blair organized a social exclusion task force, and Anna talked about racial segregation, and this is sort of kind of on the opposite side, because he wanted to more of make a social, ideal social mix of people with different income distribution and different racial properties. And the thing is, when you really try to forcibly mix people together that are within a different parts of the society, that really doesn't work well, and it ended up being a huge failure, and it actually ended up segregating people more. So I think what you mentioned with the immigrants as well, I think we should really, really examine certain groups very, very carefully before we can actually enforce a certain policy to a certain group or a certain city.
What other forces may threaten or hinder cultural life?
Yeah, so we were talking about, lack of transportation is definitely a big part of that. America has had a policy of creating large highways and expressways. Even in New York City, Washington Square Park was really, really close to becoming a 10-lane freeway at some point. So what we need to do, or what we could do, is instead of taking up a lot of space, potentially destroying neighborhoods to create private transportation, we can focus on affordable public transportation to create more equitable cities, get people from here to there where they need to go, and that can really revitalize local economies as well as stimulate cultural interactions, because in subways, people are playing beautiful music, they're meeting each other, running into each other, so there's a lot of valid cultural exchange that could be occurring. And in addition to that, what we're seeing right now is a time where we are globalizing and we are wanting to improve our cities, keep up with technological advancement. Gentrification, or pushing other people out, is something that we really need to look out for. And as an architect, we can do that with repurposing buildings that already exist and making them better, as opposed to tearing things down and creating brand new buildings, and preserving architecture that meant a lot to other people before, and working with local stakeholders and involving them in the process.
Funny thing that Anna mentioned about just instead of like rather destroying and building units, she talked about how we should like repurpose the buildings and sort of like renovate in a way. And there was Hope 6 program organized by the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1980s. And what it did was basically it wanted to provide an affordable housing units to a lot of lower class people. And what it did was it destroyed 20,000 housing units, the previous housing units, and it built 60,000 extra housing units for people. But what it ended up happening was that a lot of real estate developers and a lot of investors bought all those housing units and they acquired all those assets and then they renovated it and they sold it in a really high price. And it ended up just enforcing more gentrification and added more burden to the previously existing housing affordability crisis. So you can see sort of like how enforcing those and just destroying housing units and replacing it with new units doesn't really help, or it doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, it's definitely a systematic problem where we have on one hand lobbyists, and on the other hand we have people who inhabit these places and have for generations. And we need to make sure that no matter how much money they all have an equal voice in the development that's going on and how the changes are going to happen in their city.
Through what specific views, right? I know you sort of have a more analytical perspective where you, correct me if I'm wrong, take a more natural perspective towards urban ecology, specifically gentrification. What sort of how do you view gentrification, both in results and sort of the process as a whole, from your sort of given perspectives?
Yeah, I focus on design, as you mentioned, from a humanistic lens. So that means when I want to design or create or shape a city, you really want to do it for the people. And by that, I mean all the people there, not just the top percentage of people. And that means protecting their rights and also involving them. So from a policy perspective, that means getting everybody out since day one. Usually the people who go to committee sessions and meetings are the people who are upset about it. So as we evolve and we have these talks, it's really important to recognize these people and also recognize the times when they're available. So again, to combat gentrification, designing sustainability, which may sound vague, but these include a lot of practices which, making travel accessible so people can work and be on the same income scale as others, have mixed usage, which means people don't have to go far from their residency to have access to groceries and public spaces, and also having these public spaces and parks where people can have recreational time and interact with others no matter what class they're from.
For gentrification, although all those modern researchers and theories really point towards very different directions of gentrification. For example, commercial gentrification or cultural gentrification. The term itself was defined by Ruth Glass as more of an economic term of the middle class being displaced by the gentry class, which tends to be more of the higher income class. And there was a famous theory called rent gap theory proposed by Neil Smith. And he talked about how there is a big gap between the current market price of the housing units and the potential market prices that the real estate developers or the investors think that it would be in the future. So that's why the gentrification sort of happens. So that traditional economic perspective has not really disappeared in the past. So I think a really important way to approach gentrification is we really need to understand the basic dynamics of the gentrification in terms of economic perspective, such as rent gap theory, but also we need to understand the new sort of a modern way of people defining gentrification that involves a lot of different factors, such as culture and shifting demographics.
We don't have a ton of time left, so if you don't mind, I know you have a question about climate, so I'm going to ask you to wait. I'm going to ask one question, and then if you can wrap it on that. So what does the future look like to both of you?
I'm actually very optimistic about the future of cities. Like I mentioned before, there is a lot of trial and error in what architects, planners, engineers, transport engineers are all trying to do. But I feel like if we breach interdisciplinary bounds and have a public and private and local involvement on that scale, we can really develop for the people involved. Additionally, I see cities that have wider streets, wider boulevards where people can come and interact. I see cities with more public space and more reclaimed space. Right now, I know you mentioned environment, but there is a trend that humans have destroyed a lot of the marshes and the banks for so long, and now architects are trying to bring them back because they are so vital to our ecosystems. And I see those being a big part of the parks of the future by trying to bring back original places that we've lost and trying to make them accessible for everyone.
From my perspective and more of a demographic and statistical perspective, I know that these days people do understand that cities are all about the people, and it's not just it is actually an organism that involves a lot of different factors in it. For example, new urbanism in the 1990s has really exposed to us to understand the cities as sort of like a mechanism instead of like a definite concept. But I think we really need to re-emphasize the concept of diversity at this point. It is really important to understand that how much the different groups of people contribute to a society, and how different viewpoints in politics or in social sciences or in any fields could be really, really impactful.
Yeah. As an architect, you see people hiding away in houses or apartments, and they're so separate from each other. And as our world grows to become more bipartisan, if we can involve people more in the democratic process of actually creating our cities, then maybe there's space for us to create a city where people can talk about things and get involved in things and become more community participants.
I love this idea that you guys are sort of hitting on perfectly, which is that cities are more than just individual pieces, but they have these subsets to them: transportation, demographics, sort of individual cultures, things of that sort. How do you think climate change specifically may affect either any of those specifically or cities as a whole?
Climate change poses a very severe threat. I think in a lot of cities, in a lot of towns as well, because we're also looking at a bunch of microorganisms. There are people living on coastal areas that are of certain racial demographics, and they're being hit way harder than others because of flooding and not having the financial resources that other cities and other lobbyists would have. So I think we should be allocating our resources more thoughtfully. When we are thinking about planning and policy, we should be thinking about all of the areas of the city. We should be thinking about bringing some things back. I know in Asia, we've lost a massive percentage of mangrove trees because of coastal development, which are more effective than concrete barriers in absorbing typhoon energy and all those things. So instead of destroying our nature or even emulating it and trying to emulating it in our tech, we should maybe start bringing it back and making sure that it's accessible for everyone, like I said before.
I think because city itself is defined by concentration of mass population, I think we should use cities as a resource to educate the public and definitely use that as a resource to really raise awareness of the climate change. We've seen the climate change strike going on past few months, and we've seen a lot of different ways that people in the city have engaged into the changing climate change, and I think it's really, really important that we really utilize this city as like a fundamental ground to really expand the ideas and like really educate the world about how like severe the climate change issue really is.
We don't have any more time, I'm afraid. I could listen to both of you for hours. I'm sure you could also. It's so interesting to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for coming to share your ideas with us. And to our audience, I hope you enjoyed this. This is really an inspiring moment for, I think, for Dylan and I, if I might speak for you, because these young people are so well versed in their topic, and they are doing such great work and will continue to do that in the future. So good luck to both of you.
Thank you.
And thanks for being our guests.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Well, this is Value Education, and we're delighted you tuned in, and we hope that you will again. I just would like to make a quick plug for the fact that we are doing a TEDx conference at the Rye Neck School District on March 20th. So that's Friday, March 20th from 6 to 9:30. And the theme of this TED conference is climate. We hope to see you there. Thanks for watching.